Where are Florida State and Miami as college football programs, and what's next for the Seminoles and the Canes?
You are Locked On Seminoles, your daily podcast on the Florida State Seminoles. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome, everyone. This is Brian Smith with a happy Monday edition of Locked On Seminoles. Please subscribe and like this channel, share it wherever you can, and comment on YouTube. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Today's show is going to be kind of a rundown where Florida State's at, where Miami is at, just my opinions on it. I've got 5 categories for Florida State that I like. I got 3 for Miami. Got a few questions for both. Going to talk a little bit about their schedule, so the short term for this season, and then just an opinion about where they're going and what needs to happen for it to be good for either program. So let's start with Florida State. Again, I have 5 things that I'm going to talk about. These are not necessarily anything more than my subjective opinion. And if you think that A, I'm wrong, or B, that there's something you want to add or delete from it, fire away. This is just opinion. This is not anything that is substantial beyond that, but it's from a firsthand look from watching them, studying them, stats, recruiting, transfer portal, and everything else. Any of the schools down south, I'm pretty adept at, and obviously these 2 in particular, because they are rivals. Florida State, the thing that I argued with myself, like, which one is number one here? Is it development or play calling? That would be my number one, and it's really 1A, 1B. I really enjoy the play calling for Florida State on offense, and I thought defensively it was actually pretty good last year because they played to their strength, and that being the secondary and the pass rush. Overall, like, their pass defense was elite. So I'm going to go play calling for this past year, but this next season it might be development because you're trying to add on to a quarterback in DJ Uyunglele. Offensive line's basically back. They have a lot of good running backs. A couple are younger, but they got Rodell. They coming in as an extra, like he would start for most schools. Do I think that he'll be the starter? That's debatable. I mean, maybe he starts a few games, but I think we all know Tofili is pretty much going to be the starter for Florida State. They got some development to do at receiver, tight end, but they got talent. And then defensively, that's where it's going to be more interesting. Linebackers got some new guys going to have to play, but they also got experienced guys from the portal that are talented, and they got more guys up front on defense that, the people probably aren't giving them credit for. Like Jackson didn't play last year, so it's kind of forgotten about, but he should be healthy and ready to roll, and it's hard to find 6'6", 300-pound guys that can move like him. You got Kelly coming in from Colorado State, etc. They got plenty of opportunities there, and they're just loaded in the back end, even though they lost greedy fans. So play calling and development, I think, far and away are the 2 things that I like best about Florida State. And it's generally a good sign, regardless of the program, if those are the areas you're going to talk about. How many fans complain about play calling? Pretty much all of them. I don't care what school it is. I don't care if it's pro, college, whatever. But Florida State, by and large, especially offensively, is given a lot of high grades. Defensively, they got to prove that they could do things last year that most schools couldn't, especially that Clemson game. The defense carried the day in some critical moments. They deserve kudos for that. And then if you look at it overall, big games, even when they didn't have their A game, they would pull something out with a really big play, whether it's coming up with a blitz, a screen, whatever, to blow open an opportunity to get a victory. So I like those 2 areas the most. The third thing I like about Florida State's program is something that probably is as important as anything else, and this is for any program, but probably doesn't get talked about as much because there's not as much access to it, and that's strength and conditioning. This is just secondhand information from people that I know, and basically it's like this. They find a program fit for each kid. There's a certain thing you got to do, and you got to have some kind of systematic or militaristic personality traits. You got to get everybody to be on the same page. I get that. And there's certain things that everybody does, but you got to adjust to players, and you got to find a way to get it better each and every year. You can never satisfy yourself with, hey, we've reached the mountain, now we're just going to maintain. Maintaining means you're losing as a general rule. That's an old saying. If you're just staying the same, you're getting worse, whatever. I think Florida State has done a tremendous job with this. You look at the defensive line, how they held up last year. That's a position that takes a lot of attrition, linebackers, etc. Like they were thin at linebacker. Linebackers played a ton of snaps. That is a big part of strength and conditioning. It's just being on the field. It's your number one trait as a player, in this case, as a program. Are you keeping your young men healthy enough to play and being productive? It's a checkbox. It's a really important one because without it, you're not going to go undefeated in the regular season. I can guarantee you that. They would have never sniffed a chance at playing Louisville in the title game. So I think strength and conditioning is the other thing that is tremendous. Last year was the first example of that. We could really see it because they had enough pieces in play in terms of roster balance, which I'll talk about in a second, to show it. This year will be further opportunity because, as I'm just getting ready to talk about, Florida State's roster doesn't have like a major hole. Going into last year, I still had questions about some spots you still needed to know, and like linebacker wasn't the deepest, but they got through it because of that strength and conditioning program. And now they've got more depth everywhere. Receiver isn't perfect by any means, but they got a lot of athletes. Running back has a ton. Offensive line has guys that may not start at Florida State that could start elsewhere. You combine that with the strength and conditioning program, and that's a great sign for Florida State. The next thing with roster balance is like, let's just talk about the piece of the pie that has struggled for a long time, and that was offensive line. There's no doubt that it's in a much better place in 2022 than it was in 21, then 23 than it was in 22. And I expect that to be the same again this year. They're just slowly building. Atkinson and all those guys are doing a great job, but they have to continue with that, with the strength and conditioning program, recruiting the right kids, etc. And Florida State's in on a bunch of recruits. So that's going well. And that's the final point here for this part of the show. The recruiting and transfer portal balance that Florida State has conservatively top 10 nationally over the last 2 years. Now we're early in the era of NIL and the transfer portal, but I don't think there are too many schools that are better. Anybody can just say Georgia and plug that into about any answer in college football, but they don't use the portal a ton, so they're not necessarily the best comparison here. They just kind of cherry pick. For a team that has relied on the portal, I've said it a million times here, I'll go with the Noles over anybody over the last 2 years. There could be others, and if you want to pick them, that's more than welcome to do so. But they've really developed the kids they brought in for the portal because they've taken kids that other schools couldn't do much with, and they've ended up being really, really good. And they've also taken guys that were already good, and they became household names nationally. Keon Coleman being a great example. Jared Verse was good at Albany, but it's Albany. He continued to get better, etc. So both sides of the ball have done that. All these pieces, all 5 of these pieces have worked together over the time that Norvell and his staff have been here. And I think it's why they're not just good, but a really good program long-term. So to think about it this way, name something that you would go, wow, this is just not working. They've got a big hole here, etc. Is there anything like that for Florida State right now? I don't think so. The only 2 things that I'm nitpicking here that I said need to find a way to come up with something that's a goal, something they haven't done since Norvell's been there, besides obviously win the national title. Well, the first part to get to doing that is they need to beat what is, this is a key word, it's all 100% subjective, a perceived elite team. Somebody that's ranked in the top 5, something like that in the regular season. The problem is Florida State didn't play a team like that last year that really kind of met what their expectations were, because it was supposed to be LSU and their defense was bad and Florida State took them to the woodshed because of it. But after that, did they play a team that was ranked super, super high? No, Clemson was kind of there, but I don't think that was the biggest of deals, except for the fact that Florida State just hadn't beaten them in a while. So that was a good win, but this isn't Florida State with Blondie at quarterback, or at Clemson with Blondie at quarterback, but Florida State still won in one of the most difficult places. So that's good. Now can they win a top 5 game? Unfortunately, you can't help but, play the teams on your schedule. Maybe there will be, or maybe there won't. If I had to guess for this next year, the game in South Bend against Notre Dame is the most likely. That's in November. If both those teams ended up being top 5, that game would be the number 1 watch game that weekend. I can about guarantee you. The other thing is just win a playoff game. If you get to the playoff this year, next year, whatever, it's one thing to make it. It is quite another to win. If you get a playoff win and you kind of get some momentum and get attention, It will help recruiting. It will help with the transfer portal. It'll help with NIL and everything else. So that's something to think about. Up next, we're going to talk a little bit about Florida State's schedule, then transition to what Miami has going on and compare them to Florida State. That's next, right here on Locked On Seminoles. When you're hiring for a small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. Whether you're trying to find an intern or somebody that's straight out of college or a 10-year vet, your small business can find what it needs with LinkedIn Jobs. It's not just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else. Even those who aren't actively searching for a new job might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of our LinkedIn users don't visit other job sites. If you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Are you tired of watching Fox Sports and ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. It's available on YouTube and free on the Amazon Fire TV's app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. So Florida State's schedule this year is kind of interesting. And like I was checking on FanDuel a little bit ago, they've got a really unique scenario with playing an overseas game. They play Georgia Tech, hard enough team to kind of figure out based on last year. I believe their quarterback led the league in touchdown passes, but also interceptions. So it's kind of goofy. It's an overseas game. For what it's worth, Florida State's an 11.5-point favorite. Okay. But what's the schedule like overall, and how much does that game play into? You can look at this a million different ways. So here's what we got. The first game is in Dublin, Ireland, of all places, August the 24th. It's a noon kickoff on ESPN. If they win that game, and they should, but I wouldn't just lock it in, then you're talking about having an opportunity to play the game against Boston College. It's a Monday game. It's a long weekend. I'm not sure what to take from it. Florida State's played in a few of these, but they played Boston College, who gave them fits last year. I think they'll win, but it's still Boston College, and they've got Thomas Castellanos. You don't want to just figure you're going to win. The next one's also a bit goofy, and it's on a Saturday. It's a little less than 2 weeks after that. Memphis, they got a quarterback that's going to get drafted, and it's a team that Norvell used to coach for. So there's emotion with that, but it's still Memphis. You have to win, right? You play Cal. This game is kind of weird because when was the last time Florida State played Cal, period? And they're going to be playing them. You know, it's just, it's weird. I can't get over Stanford and Cal being in the ACC. That's just me. Like, I don't care if they played them out there in Tallahassee, and this game is in Tallahassee, but it's just bizarre. I hope Florida State comes out ready to play, because Cal does not exactly excite people, but they are a Power 4 team, so they need to be ready. The game that is a little bit different, road game, a true road game, SMU. That game's on the 28th of September in Dallas. They're going to be able to throw it around. Florida State just needs to be mentally ready. My concern with that is the game they have the weekend after, and that's Clemson. Clemson's obviously a good team. I still don't think they're elite anymore, but they're really good, and they got beat at their house last year, and they had a chance to win that game, and Florida State took it from them. They're going to come in with nothing to lose. Florida State needs to be ready for it. Duke, the game after, they have to beat Duke. No offense. They lost their head coach. They lost their quarterback. That should be a team that's on the down. Then the team that we're going to compare here in a second, Miami, the annual rivalry game, 26th of October. That game is at Hard Rock Stadium. That'll be a great game. I think Florida State, the last I saw, was favored by like a point and a half. We'll talk about that game in earnest a little bit later in the month. But North Carolina is after that. That's tough. Even though it's back at home, that's a pretty good team. They got one of the best running backs in the country. Solid game. But then you also have to turn around and go to Notre Dame. Without a doubt, in my opinion, this is the hardest game on the schedule for Florida State, because Notre Dame's probably the most talented and best all-around roster in terms of balance, and it's going to probably be cold. Florida kids don't do well in cold. Curious to see what the weather is. That game will be very important to Florida State. You play Charleston Southern, then you play the Gators, who we'll talk about very soon here on the channel. Kind of overview of their team like we're doing with Miami today. Until otherwise proven, I'm not picking Florida to beat Florida State, quite frankly, or anybody else. That's great, but they've got a pretty solid roster. So with Florida State, I think overall they're one of 5 to 8 programs that's the most balanced, the most consistent, and they're trending in the right direction. Is that something that you can say about everybody? No. But at the same time, Florida State's kind of earned it. They did it slowly. They built it the right way by not trying to force things. They developed a lot of their own kids, and then some of the kids that didn't get developed at other schools, they brought them in through the transfer portal, made it happen. It's arguably the most unique program in college football right now with how they did it, but it's worked for Florida State, and that's the bottom line. So right now, I mean, like you're grading at A minus is my guess. I guess you can't just give an A. That's like perfect A minus because they haven't won a title yet. But considering where Florida State was just 2 years ago to now, it's kind of hard to complain. With that, it's time to transition to the arch rival. That's Miami. I have 3 things in particular I like about their program, and then I got a couple that I'm really concerned about. Florida State, I had to dig into it. With Miami, I'm a little more concerned about a couple of things, and they're quite honestly not going to surprise anybody no matter which team you root for. Number one, since Cristobal and his staff arrived in Coral Gables, I mean, that roster needed help. He has revamped it very, very well, especially with players with size, just in general. Forget the position, just size in general. And then more specifically, O-line is immensely better. They've got 3 or 4 guys they think are NFL guys at minimum on the offensive line on their depth chart, if not more, maybe 6 or 7. They're pretty young there. And to be honest with you, that's where they need to win games because they're built that way. They obviously brought in Damian Martinez from the portal. They're hoping to get Mark Fletcher back, but he's got a foot injury that could cost him some time, may not play early in the season. They brought in Cam Ward from Washington State. So they're balancing their roster with their holes at, and they've done a good job of recruiting quarterbacks too. They got a couple of young guys that are pretty talented. They're in a good spot. They also have a transfer that's a backup at quarterback too. They played at Jared Versil school, if I remember right. He's from Albany. But at the same time, Miami still isn't quite where you need to be because this is year 3 for them. And you don't know yet with Cristobal and his staff about those things. It just looks good on paper, right? So let's flip it to defense to kind of get further analysis of it. Defensive line's a lot better, and they got Reuben Bain. That cures a lot of ills. But they still needed to go to the portal to get players. They got the kid from Michigan State. They're trying to get the Barron kid that's been all over the place. I'm a little iffy about that whole situation. I heard that's an NIL deal. Good luck with that. But their secondary isn't quite where it needs to be. So the roster is good. It's 10 times better than it was, and that's the first thing for them. But it's not quite where Florida State's, especially secondary, in my opinion. Now, and I mentioned like the size up front, just real quick. Their D-line is much bigger now. They needed help at D-tackle. They've got a couple of guys that are younger, that are a year older in their program. Like Josh Horton was a freshman last year, played a little bit. He's going to be good. He's a Langston Hughes kid out of the Atlanta area. That's going to help them. They didn't have the ability to stuff the run in a traditional way quite as much last year, but their coaching was tremendous, and they found ways to get it done. Like their middle linebacker had 7 sacks. That's a rare stat. Great job by their coaching staff. The other thing that's really unique for them, I don't care what skill spot it is on offense, they got a lot of talent. Tight end, receiver, and running back. Speed everywhere, playmakers. If their O-line holds up like you think it should based on how they've recruited and what they did last year, that should be a team that consistently hits big plays. One of the more dynamic teams. The only thing there is Cam Ward is a guy that fumbles quite a bit. Had 14 fumbles last season. He shores that up, and Washington State's O-line was terrible. Miami's is really good. They should be a pretty good team this year on offense. Defensively, looking at it, they don't have quite the same depth in the secondary, but they lost 2 guys early to the draft. That's hard. There's nothing you can do about that. And then they also have a scenario where they need a guy that's a pure big-time corner to kind of take away somebody. They got some good players, but I don't know if they got an elite corner yet. Damari Brown is probably their best bet. Coming up next, we're going to talk about the major concerns I have for Miami, and we're also going to talk about what I project for the next couple of years for both of them right here on Locked On Seminoles. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. As I mentioned a little bit ago, the first game of the year for the Noles is 11.5-point spread against Georgia Tech. The game is in Ireland. It's a unique game, but you can already check that out on FanDuel. So take the time to do that if you get a chance. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the schedule and a couple of the things that Miami has some issues with. Let's start with the issues. They just didn't get it done last year, talent to record. They gave away some games. Quarterback play was an issue. They got Cam Ward this year. They shouldn't have that. They got more depth on the O-line. They got bigger on the D-line. They have more depth at tight end by a mile. And they have more numbers at receiver. Running back, they brought in Damian Martinez. In short, there's no reason for them not to win at least 8 games. That's conservatively. Talent-wise, they should win 9 or more. I believe FanDuel has Florida State and Miami, if I remember right, at 9.5. It might have changed in the last few days. That's a team that needs to prove it. It's year 3 for Cristobal. He needs to prove something. So that's one concern I have. You haven't done it yet, so we just need to see it. Number 2, one of the reasons that they haven't reached that is just the Georgia Tech game last year, the blunder. There's no way around it. You got to bring it up. And then they just don't seem to find a way to get over the top in games where they're more obviously physical team, faster team, whatever. Like they got beat by Rutgers in the bowl game. I'm sorry. I know they had opt-out stuff, but they just didn't play like they wanted to be there. Those are the kinds of things when your team is still striving, it shouldn't happen. I expect that out of a team that had super high expectations and thought they were going to win a national title or whatever, and it didn't happen, and then they go to a bowl game because those players don't want to be there. Miami wasn't that team. So that gave me some pause. I need to see them be more consistent. This is on players. This is not a coaching thing. This is on players. You have to prove you want to be there no matter the opponent. You are not an elite team until you are an elite team. They have all the ability to do it this year, but they got to prove it. So we'll kind of see with them on that, but their schedule is also very unique too, because they start the season at Florida, come home, play Florida A&M the next weekend, no big deal. Ball State after that, they're going to win those. It's kind of an unusual game because they play USF on the 21st of September in Tampa. I'm not sure what to think of USF. I don't study that team very much, but they have nothing to lose, and those games are dangerous. And this is the kind of game Miami in the last 20 years has found a way to goof up. They then have a Friday night game at home against Virginia Tech. Drones and that team have the ability to win that game. They can really get after the quarterback. They've got a good quarterback, but it's at home. These are the kinds of games Miami, again, sometimes goofs up. They cannot lose this kind of game. They go to Cal. Like I mentioned with Florida State hosting them, I don't know if Miami will care about that game, but they should. Again, you got to prove it before you're elite. Then they have a bye. And then the game that is probably the most difficult for them as a road contest at Louisville on the 19th of October. This is the game Miami loses every year. A team on the road that's good, they have comparable talent, but they don't get it done. They need to prove that in year 3 under Cristobal. 26th, obviously, is Florida State, Miami. That's self-explanatory. Huge game. They're going to beat Duke. It's at home. They go to Georgia Tech. They lost to them last year in that goofy game. Do they get revenge? Then they finish out with Wake Forest at home, and they go to Syracuse. Those are games they should win, but will they? I don't know. Miami there's so many games I say, well, there's still a chance because they just don't prove it against mid-level teams. They just don't. But the talent level this year is as high, and the depth especially higher than it's been in a long time. I'd imagine Miami's going to be better, but to me, they still just have to prove it. They're one of 3 or 4 teams in college football, if you like betting win totals, that I would just stay clear of. I honestly would. They're a team that is very frustrating to figure out week to week, let alone a 12-game season. Just my opinion on it. So long-term, quick thoughts on Florida State and Miami. I'm solidified, as I've said many times here on Locked On Seminoles, Florida State's got a good program. They're recruiting pretty well. The portal is to a point where they're being more selective because they can be. They have depth. They don't have a spot on the roster. You go, man, They'd be great, but they have this issue. Miami's not far behind that. They're pretty close. But the problem with Miami is I'm not concerned like completely. It's not just like a detriment, but I don't know if they have a pure guy at corner or whatever. You can take a player away. D-line's got talent. Ruben Bain's great. They got Francisco Maligo at middle line, but they got some dudes. But can they take somebody away? I think Florida State's secondary is definitely better, and that's the biggest difference between the two programs. Everything else is pretty comparable, but Florida State's a further along with the development, strength conditioning programs proven. I'll know more about Miami's strength and conditioning program after this year. This is year 3. Looks like it's pretty good. I didn't even comment on it yet. I just want more time to look at it. But they're just a little behind the DB, in my opinion. So that's going to do it for Locked On Seminoles. Once again, please like this podcast and subscribe. We will see you again on Tuesday. This has been Locked On Seminoles.